our topic today is climate victory gardens. And this comes out of a, this is basically a movement that echoes what was done during World War I and World War II. Citizen armies, if you will, growing food to feed the home front, but also to feed the soldiers. So this notion where we can get even small gardens and large groups of people coming together to address a humongous global level and scale problem is not new. I found when I first watched the An Inconvenient Truth, right, the Al Gore documentary about climate change. And this was what now, almost 2 decades ago when this came out. And there's this real feeling of just devastation and frustration that came at the end of this documentary, where they give you some suggestions of what you can do, right, with this humongous issue and what can I do at home. And a lot of the suggestions were like, change your light bulbs, right, be a little bit more energy efficient. Well, I'm here to tell you that you can use your yard, no matter how small, in a way that really does make an impact. And I'm going to go through the 10 principles, and you'll see the Climate Victory Garden movement has some that vary a little bit, but these are the ones that I find most impactful and most meaningful and most easy to incorporate into your own habits and your own spaces. So we're going to go through those today. What is a climate victory garden? The first step is adding gardens, particularly vegetable gardens for growing food, to your yard. But more than that, climate victory gardens enact particular kinds of plantings and particular kinds of garden practices to both minimize our negative impacts, right? When you're changing your light bulb, you're reducing your own carbon footprint or something like that. That's one benefit to having a climate victory garden. But I'm also here to tell you that we can do more than that. What we can do is maximize carbon sequestration. We can also have that positive impact where we're pulling some of that carbon out of our landscape and storing it underground by particular sorts of plantings. I will talk more about that. And we're going to restore habitat for our pollinators, other wildlife, which are really vital cogs in our food chain. So the first number on your cards that I gave you today is to grow food. Now we don't tend to talk about this, but it's estimated that our food system is responsible for an estimated 1/4 to 1/3 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, this is more emissions than all of our cars put together in the United States. A system of agricultural practice that's based on industrial farming. It depletes the soil, right? A lot of exposed open ground. So we're having a lot of leakage of the carbon that gets stored. That's one of the problems. Monoculture in farming also feeds the need to use a lot of pesticides, another major problem with industrial ag. But there's also the ways that we ship a lot of our foods all over the world, right? So the fruits that you're getting in the middle of winter are coming from the other side of the world and taking your refrigerated airplanes in order to do that transportation. One of the things that I've talked about in my own work as a garden consultant is the idea of cut flower gardens. A lot of environmentalists look at annual flower growing as a non-starter, right? Why would you do that? You have to plant native perennials. Well, if you think about it, the cut flower market, most of our cut flowers that you buy in the grocery store come from places like, I think it's, what is the biggest ones? Colombia is a really big one. Ecuador is another big one. Kenya, I think, is another one. So they're coming from very far away places. They tend to be, these are not organically certified flower productions. These farms are very based in practices of pesticide use that are harmful, obviously, to the planet, but also to the workers who are growing those flowers. And then they are also shipping them in just a few days in these refrigerated spaces. So the more we can do to grow things local, that's one thing that we can impact on. And we're also cutting back then on the packaging. So when you grow your own food, it's not coming to you in one of those plastic clamshells that I can never tell what we can recycle and what we can't, right? And so we're impacting a lot of different things just by growing our own. And you can container garden, you can do raised beds, you can also incorporate food into your existing garden spaces or into your landscapes. So one of my major, worse than a pet peeve, is burning bush plants. I inherited many burning bush plants. They were planted by a neighbor in my neighborhood, and when I bought the house, they had just expanded and gone all over. And people plant them and buy them for this beautiful landscape in the fall, right? It's a lovely color in the fall. Well, I'm here to tell you that high bush blueberry, beautiful fall color, right? This can feed us. You can leave it, let it feed the birds, right? Another great benefit to this. So we can provide edible foods for our families and also for the creatures that we share this world with by incorporating them into our existing landscape practices. Reduce our lawns is one of the major things that you can do in order to create a climate victory garden. This is green concrete for a number of ways. It's green concrete because when it rains, grass, traditional ryegrass, has very little root system. It doesn't soak up any of the moisture, so water runs off in problematic ways. In order to maintain this monoculture, what are we putting on our grass? Lots of weed killer, right? We're putting on lots of weed killer, we're putting on lots of fertilizer, which then gets washed into our waterways, right, when it rains, because it's green concrete. And this is an inhospitable place for our wildlife, for our pollinators. There's nowhere to nest, there's nowhere to feed, there's nowhere to abide over winter in this particular space. This is also a problem because of the labor and the energy expended on maintaining this lawn, right? So all of our mowers that we need to do this, our leaf blowers that we all need in order to maintain this lawn. Now, people love their lawns, and a little bit of lawn for play, a little bit of lawn to counteract some of your other activities to set off a garden and things like that is great. So I'm going to tell you a couple creative ways that you can still have something resembling a lawn, but maybe rethink how we use it, how we plant it, and maybe ways that we can reduce it a little bit. One of those is by giving some of your lawn space back to trees, make it some of your forest, back to shrubs, perennial plantings that have a longer root system, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, that will actually help with carbon capture and storage. So plant things that will do better than the lawn at that particular activity. Next, we have the idea of a mixed ground cover that does not need to be mowed. Here's an example of that. This particular one is a lot of ajuga, but there's planting clover is one way that you can really feed the pollinators, create something that needs less maintenance. There's various types of what they call eco-grass that grows without needing to be mowed. Gets to particular heights, it sort of flops over a little bit. It's not this look, but again, it can reduce our need to mow and give us something that will essentially maintain itself while keeping an open space for us. You can leave sections of your grass long, and you can even interplant with wildflowers. If you don't want to convert your whole backyard, say, or your front yard, to a wildflower meadow, there's ways that you can still interplant and maintain sections of the lawn that do not get mowed and keep sections where, if you have a 3-year-old like me, they can still run around and play. The other thing you can do, which is the easiest thing, if you don't do anything after this talk, you can do this. No mow May. Has everybody heard of No Mow May?
No.
No. Okay, well good. I get to tell you about it. So No Mow May starts as a movement out of England, and it's this idea that our pollinators need help and need a boost this time of year when we really just don't have a lot of food for them, right? This is the time of fruit trees. This is the time of some spring bulbs, but there's just not a lot out there. So if everybody, for 1 month, lays off their lawn mowing, right, then we can both maintain all of that clover, even dandelions make a difference. You might find that your lawn has a lot more interplanted in it than you know about. This is my lawn. Here, I've got fluids, I've got flowering grasses that are native, I've got wild violets, that's another native plant. I have found all manner of native perennials mixed into my lawn, including things like yarrow, etc. And this is my mom's lawn at the farm. So you can see all kinds of different things that you might not have even known are growing in your lawn by leaving it. It's beautiful and it's helpful for 1 month. Also think about the impact that we can have by laying off all of those mowers for 1 month. Again, another one related to that, use human power, pretty self-explanatory. Think about how many times you go outside to do your own poking around at something and your neighbor's doing some leaf blowing, right? Or some weed whacking or some mowing. Inevitably, it's noise pollution, but it's also expending an awful lot in gasoline. So if you can't do things by hand, like raking, then also look into various electric options is a better way to go. Use water efficiently. So a few options to do this. Again, we can't help other parts of the world that have major water problems. The best thing that you can do for them is to use energy efficiently. So this goes for this particular resource of water, but it also goes for all of our other resources as well. One thing that's very easy that you can do, and if you suffered from drought and were impacted the way that I was at my house, a rain barrel can be a huge help. It's a passive way to make a difference. Hook this up to one of your downspouts that comes off a wide section of roof. You can use that water to water your gardens, and also by doing basic things like watering at the roots of plants rather than using big open sprinkler systems, choosing your time of day to water so that you're watering either early in the morning or later in the evening, then you're not going to lose a lot of water to evaporation. This is a very big one for me. Go peat-free and keep materials local. Peatlands make up just 3% of the land on Earth. We have them in tropical places. We have them in cold climates as well. But they store twice as much carbon as all of the world's forests combined. We need our peatlands, and people are not talking about them. And when you go to the garden center and you buy a bag of potting soil, it is almost impossible in this country to not buy one with peat in it. So we are mining our peatlands. Peat is essentially a kind of moss that when compressed in a very boggy landscape over huge amounts of time, it builds up and stores all of the Earth's carbon. When something dies on land, plant matter dies on land, it's going to evaporate all of that into the carbon into the environment. When it's trapped and stored in that moss and compressed underground, we've got these essentially like historic, mines or refrigerators or freezers. So you can travel to places like Scotland where they've mined a lot of their peat for things like use in fire, burning, and stuff like that. A lot of their peatlands over time, they're still uncovering, ancient butter, right, that was stored underground because it's such a great, it mummifies animals and peoples. I mean, it's this really wonderful storage system that happens naturally. So we need these peat bogs to be maintained. We don't need them cut down in tropical places to make and drain to make use for palm oil plantations and things like that. So when you can buy peat-free, there's a couple ways you can do that. There are a few potting soil companies. One is called Back to the Roots. They sell at a lot of the big box stores. They are a peat-free company. They are very rare. The other thing you can do is do what you can, as I said, to keep things local and to try to make as much as you can of your own soil. So a good alternative, because it is has a similar kind of consistency, is to use leaf mold. Leaf mold is nature's compost. Leaf mold in New England is abundant, and it's free, and it's easy. And remember, I don't want you to use your leaf blower so much. So one of the things that I do in the fall is I rake my leaves into my gardens. This is what my gardens look like under their flowers. Now, if you don't like that look, or if you want it to break down faster so that you can create leaf mold to mix into your potting soils, because that's what you can do. If you do buy potting mix to start your seeds or something like that, you can make it last longer. Make that peat mix last a little longer by adding in some leaf mold and extending it out a little bit. To make leaf mold is very easy. You rake all your leaves into, you can put it in a bag if you needed to, but you put it in a bin, put it in one pile, put it in one space. Make sure you have moisture, because that's part of the process. And if you have chopped it up ahead of time, say you had to pick it up with your lawnmower or something, that will make it go faster, but you don't need to do that. It will break down itself over 6 months to a year, and you will have nice, fresh soil. It does have nutrients. Think about this. This is what happens on a woodland floor, right? To create compost for all of those plants on a woodland floor, it's just falling down and resting. So it does have some nutrients. It is bringing in worms, right, to do that process of decomposition. So they are adding their castings to the mix, right, as well. But it's not quite as nutrient rich as if you were going to make your own compost. I do encourage you to try to do that as well. But covering and building soil is very important because, again, we're trying to reject these industrial farming practices that leave a lot of exposed, depleted topsoil, right? When you can do things in a way that are no-till, so if you can do things that do not disturb the ground, because we don't want to release anything out, right? We want to suck it all down underground. That is ideal. So if you're building a new garden, for example, I advocate the lasagna compost method. This is the layer composting. You're essentially smothering with, say you've got a lot of newspaper or cardboard boxing or whatever that you have, or maybe you just have a bunch of leaves. You can smother your grass. You can add in layers of other material. Wood chips is another one that you can use. Compost, if you feel it needs a little bit more goodness mixed into it. And you're creating a layer that's going to then kill off that grass or whatever was there before, and then you're turning that grass into compost, right? It's becoming part of the nutrient-rich area. You can do this on your own gardens as well. Using a natural organic material as a mulch is going to help retain your moisture. It's going to help to repress your weeds, and it's doing all of that without you having to get in there and physically dig. Look at the root systems on the perennials. I'm forgetting this guy's name. His name is Jerry something. I have it on my notes. Anyway, he advises the ag department on ways to improve industrial agriculture. And he's holding up here perennial roots. All right, so we all know that trees, through the process of photosynthesis, are going to capture carbon, and they essentially turn it into sugar and feed. They create their woody things like roots with them, right? Perennials do the same thing. So your perennials, your shrubs, are all doing the same thing on a slightly smaller scale, right? So even if you're not planting trees, by planting perennials, you're getting some of this benefit. Again, if we looked at the lawn, I just want to point out to you, this is the root system of your lawn. You didn't even see it, did you know? Because it's teeny, teeny, tiny. The roots don't go anywhere. Even a dandelion does better than that. And it has a taproot that will at least aerate your soil a little bit. Not so. So consider the needs of wildlife and pollinators. This is a quote from Douglas Tallamy. If you don't know his work, he's a very important figure in this kind of movement, and particularly advocates for the idea of a homegrown national park. So in his quote here, he says, quote, "We are at a critical point of losing so many species from local ecosystems that their ability to produce the oxygen, clean water, flood control, pollination, pest control, carbon storage, etc., that it is the ecosystem services that sustain us, and we will become seriously compromised." Our food system, it is estimated, the human diet, is reliant on pollinators for 80%. 80% of the human diet relies on pollinators. So it should be a huge concern for us that our pollinators are dying. Now, one of the things that Ptolemy advocates in this idea of a homegrown national park is that state and national preserved lands are an important piece of the puzzle, but they are often over there, right? They're A, not enough in scope. They are also not local. What we need is to have local homes and resources and food and safe havens for our pollinators and wildlife here in every neighborhood, right? This is the pollinator pathways idea that's going to be connecting all of this together even more so than that. So how do we consider the needs of our pollinators? We have to do it in a lot of different kinds of ways. One is create cover. And this is the easiest thing you can do as a gardener, because in part it's about being a messy gardener or a lazy gardener, right? We are going to leave the stems on our plants over winter. So our native bees, the only pollinator that is on our registry of endangered species is a bumblebee, the rusty patch bumblebee. A lot of our native bees, our wild bees, do either nesting in muddy spots underground, or more often they nest in little tubes and cavities, particularly in, for example, stems of plants. So your coneflowers, your echinaceas, these are going to provide for you, for example, seed heads that birds will eat, but their stems are also going to provide cavities for those bees and pollinators to nest in. I have something similar to this, which is a bee hotel. It's given it for Mother's Day. I'm hoping I'm getting another one this year for Mother's Day as well. These are essentially, you can make them by drilling holes into wood. You can use tubular things like, anything that has sort of a hollow center. I think I've got some that were left over at the beach that we picked up that are all sort of tubular grasses and plants. Anything that they can get inside of. And you will see them. I'm already seeing them. They go inside. And then they also need access to water, because while something like a leaf cutter bee will use a leaf piece to sort of cover over their eggs and their food that they've put inside of this little tube, a lot of bumblebees will make a mud, and they'll cover over the little hole's end with a bit of mud, so you can tell when somebody's moved into your bee hotel. So leave the seed heads over winter for things like the birds. Leave the stems of things so that you can create that habitat. Leave the leaves over winter. So many of our pollinators are just tucking themselves away underneath all of that cover. Create spaces where you are piling logs, where you are piling your lawn waste or your garden waste. If it doesn't go into the compost, it can still go into a space where it can be used as a house over winter for wildlife. Consider your wildlife in all phases of their life. So many birds, all of our songbirds, go through a stage of their life cycle where they need caterpillars. They need protein. They're not just eating those seeds. And if we don't have any moths and caterpillars produced, being produced, right, then they lose a vital food source that's part of their process. We also need keystone species, things like oaks that are going to be host plants for huge numbers of wildlife, and things that are in our gardens. Butterflies, especially the monarch butterfly, is famous for the idea that individual species are tailored to individual types of plants. And while they can feed on many different kinds of foods, in order to reproduce, they have to connect with one type of species. So it's milkweed with monarch butterflies. Another example is the swallowtail butterfly and spice plants. So there's a lot of these combinations where if we lose all of that species, we also lose all of the pollinator that goes with it. So think about the needs at different phases, not just what to eat, but how they reproduce and what they need at those particular times. Learn to garden in the shade. Consider leaving a dead tree. A dead tree in the woods that's of no danger to anybody can actually do huge amounts of good for wildlife. And we have to change our practices because we need our trees. You can create beautiful floral landscapes in your woodsy backyard. That's something I have learned about and I'm doing very productively. And add water to your garden spaces. A very easy thing to do. It can be as simple as a dish. Bees and butterflies need something very, very shallow to drink out of. You can put stones into a bird bath to make it more accessible to some of our smaller critters as well. It does not have to be a big pond. Plant native species. I love this picture because it shows you that a native perennial garden does not need to be the stereotype, right, of something very scruffy and overgrown and it's not, this beautiful traditional kind of style garden. I love French country garden and I can't do that with native plants. No, not true, right? I mean, look at how beautiful this is. We've got in here wild bergamot, we've got Laetris starting to come up, that's these ones. We've got foxglove beard tongue, some wild geranium mixed in there. So there's a whole different, essentially, palette that you can work with to create just as beautiful landscapes. And there's a reason why we need our natives. Native species are often much more nutrient rich than the non-native varieties. So even though that butterfly or that bee visits your zinnias and your other kinds of flowers that are annuals, right, they might not be getting the same protein from the pollen or the same nutrients from the nectar that they would with a native variety. So the question of nutrient content might vary. Next thing is the idea that when we hybridize flowers for form or for color variations that are pleasing to humans, it can lose something in translation that makes it accessible or even visible to our pollinators. So, for example, when you, say, breed a flower to change the look and color scheme on it, right? So say a flower that has a nice, dark center with sort of a circular color around that and then a different colored blossom. When you have creatures that are in part moving with a different type of eyesight than us, you might be changing the bullseye directory that they use to find the pollen and the nectar on those plants, right? We are changing things under the surface that, it's pleasant for us, but they might no longer be able to find it, much less access it. And that's the other main one with this. If you do use plants that are non-native, try to find species that are single varieties, so not double blooms, where you can't even get to the center of the plant because there's too many ruffles, say. I'm not saying don't ever plant anything that's not native. I'm not a purist. But make sure that if you have the choice, that you too try to weave in things that are singles, and you do try to include some of these. I will say this particular one, wild bergamot bee balm, is a powerhouse for nutrition. So if you want my go-to plant for pollinators, that would be the one. Again, I've already mentioned this, native species function as host plants for a lot of butterfly and moth reproduction. And native species adapt over time to the conditions in our region. So when they're planted in the conditions that they want, in the conditions that they come from, when this is mimicked, they often need very little care and attention. So as a landscape plant that you do not have to tend beyond the first season of making sure that it gets some water, they will be much more drought tolerant and much more, you may have heard the term, resilient gardening, right? We want something that will withstand these crazy changes that our environment is throwing at us, right? Native species are going to be much more adapted to do that than other ones. Avoid all pesticides, insecticides, herbicides, and you might not use these yourself, but ask your landscapers, ask your nurseries what they use. This is a symbol. We have a Connecticut branch called CT NOFA, the Organic Farmers Association, and they do a whole course for certification to get organic land care, sustainable and organic certification. So it's kind of like when you go to the grocery store and you're buying your organic vegetables, well, it should be the same thing when we do our lawn care, right? Find a professional who is accredited, who knows these practices and is committed to them, right? So that's one thing you can do to address these needs, particularly an issue with lawn care. Many people do hire in to do their lawn care, and very few lawn care professionals are going to have this certification. So just try before you buy, make sure you check it out. And the other thing about it is that we have a particular, many pesticides and herbicides, they function like a huge sledgehammer for a tiny little nutshell. It is too much and not specific enough. We're causing a major disruption to our beneficial insects and fungi and other kinds of things. We're disrupting one piece of what is a natural cycle. So when we strive instead to create some kind of balance, when we try to encourage the natural predators to some of the less desirable creatures, we can actually, it might get worse for a while, but the system will help to correct itself if we can support that system. So strive for balance, strive for a holistic kind of community in your own backyard. And when you do go to a nursery, say, to buy a plant, definitely ask what sorts of insecticides they use. I never am able to pronounce the name, but you may have heard the idea of neonics. That's the shortened version. So everybody know what neonicotinoids are? I never pronounce it right. It's called neonics. So neonics are a class of insecticide that not only does it kill off the things that are on that plant, but it enters into the plant itself. It is present in the pollen, in the nectar of that plant. It is forever changed in its biology by this chemical substance, and it is killing our bees. It is also impacting birds. Birds that eat the seeds of plants that have been treated with neonics have problems with reproduction and also problems with migration. It's in the neurological system, both with our bees and with our birds. So you might be going to, say, buy a pollinator perennial from your local garden center, yay, right? Not knowing that that plant has previously been treated with something that has forever changed and made it deadly to our pollinators. So ask. Ask. I appreciate you staying, and I'm willing to answer any questions you might have. Yes?
Do you know what some of the brand names of the ones that have neonics are?
Neonics. Nothing you use, Alice. I mean, it's really, it's a whole class of stuff that's now, actually Connecticut has somewhat banned it, but they banned it with the exception of professional application, right? So if you are a professional, you're still using these substances. It's still used by Big Ag. It's still used in all these kinds of things. It's not, it's a class rather than a specific name.
any nurseries that you buy from that you find are the accredited?
Well, start by ones that sell native plants.
Mm-hmm.
You already have a leg in, right? So I'm more familiar with ones on the other side of the state than this side. But I know there's one called Earth Tones. I think it's up in just across the line in Rhode Island. There's one as well. Urbanscapes Nursery is one founded by this bird group in New Haven, and they are providing plants for all of these.
Oh, it's called Urbanscapes?
Urbanscapes.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. So Urbanscapes, Earth Tones is another one. So start with ones that have some native varieties, and then just a lot of, even if it is a local nursery that does have some of these things, a lot of nurseries are still buying their plants from elsewhere.
Yeah.
So you just have to ask and read your labels. Some now there's some labeling laws where it will say has been treated with neonics. So you can read your labels, make sure you're not seeing any of that on what it is that you're buying. Sorry, I can't be more definitive, but I haven't done a survey of all of our local.
Yeah, this is kind of off topic, but I'm trying to identify those worms, those really bad worms. They're really hard to identify.
The jumping worms?
Yeah, because like I told you, I did the lasagna and cardboard and digging up some of my grass. Saw a lot of worms, and I'm like, okay, are these the bad?
Because a lot of worms might also be a very good sign, right? I mean, that can be a good sign that you're getting that's great.
They're like the bad worms.
Yeah, so the best things I can tell you, they do have pictures online, they do have videos of jumping worms online. They are extra large and extra wiggly. That's the best I can tell you.
I'm like, okay, I think they were so cold.
Yes, they are extra large and extra. That's the best distinction that I have for you. But also consider where you're finding them too. So the problem with jumping worms is that they decompose things too quickly. Like they're doing too much too quickly.
Oh.
So you're growing your vegetables, right? You don't want these worms in there decomposing your vegetables, right?
Yeah.
So they do too much too quickly, and that's their problem. They're still doing all the natural processes that a worm would do, but it's like in hyperdrive.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the problem. Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for ground covers as an alternative to the traditional lawn?
Yes. Ground covers as opposed to the traditional lawn. Is it a space that you walk through, or just creating basically a low grow?
Possible to walk on it too.
Yeah. So sun versus shade. The might make a difference there as well. There's a lot of non-native things that I can definitely recommend to you. If it's an open, sunny space, there's all kinds of creeping times, and of course there's, as I said, the clovers, things like that, and the eco grass, which is more traditional grasses, which can be walked on. For slightly more shadier areas, there are those low-growing plants like the ajugas, anything that's going to fan out and sort of stop erosion and help to kind of create coverage. Most of the native varieties tend to not be creating so much as a tight ground cover as working with other plants to kind of fill in spaces around things. So something like your wild geranium is going to grow more horizontally and fill in spots that way. Creeping, woodland phlox is another low-growing species. It will put up a flower at one season of its life, but that's also something that can be done along there. I would highly recommend avoiding things like Pachysandra. Those are the ones I would steer clear of because they're very invasive.
Very invasive,
It
right?
is. It will also take
surprised
over. A lot of those periwinkles and things like that. The problem I have with Pachysandra, it's not classed as an invasive. But if a piece of it ends up, we were dumping yard waste in our woods, and things like that. If a piece is like a starfish, a piece breaks off and goes over there, you end up with a patch over there, and it spreads pretty rapidly. And lily of the valley just will quickly divide and spread. It also doesn't create much of a cover that you want to walk on. It's only there half the year, so it kind of comes out during its period and then it's done. So for erosion control, those kinds of bulbs would be fine, but creating a long alternative ground cover is not the best. Option.
I have a lot of woods that surrounds my yard, and I'm just losing all my woods with the ash borer, and so I'm like worried junk weeds are going to come in, or invasives.
Yes,
And so
it is the big problem that
What
burning
should I-
bush has come in. Right?
Yes,
It's
and I'm
now
gonna-
the understory. Our new growth forests kind of come in, or we're losing our understory, and what is moving in is the invasives, or a lot of multiflora rose.
Now,
Yeah.
So-
knotweed, yeah.
I'm thinking, okay, number one, where do I go to find things, like if I just started underplanting my woods a little at a time, where do I go to buy that?
This is
What-
what I am doing at my house right now.
Yeah, and where do I go?
Okay,
Like,
you want to find it's a question of cost too. I mean, this can be expensive if you're buying trees.
Yeah, well, maybe a little at a time,
Mhm.
but
I would not go to a nursery to do this project. Understory, if you're trying to establish things understory, it helps us with shrubs and with trees to start smaller and younger. It will be cheaper, and they will also adapt to those pre-established conditions a lot better. So you can go to something like the Arbor Day Foundation and see what they have. A native plant nursery that is on the West Coast but has just wonderful resources is Prairie Moon, and they do native plants that really demarcate your region, and they do have some shrubs and trees, and they dictate keynote species that might work well. But there's a lot of tree nurseries. Another one I've used in the past is called Chief River Nursery.
Chief River.
And they will send you, again, it's cheap, and you can get a lot of them. So
Yeah.
I've looked for native verbenas, viburnums, viburnums. They
Yes.
do well in shade. I'm getting a lot of American hazelnut, well, and full shade, and as a species that's kind of died out quite a bit.
How about like ferns or even lower things?
Absolutely. For your ground cover, look for there are other native ferns. My favorite one is the Christmas fern, because it is evergreen, or only native fern that is evergreen. I also have a wonderful moth, totally unidentified moth, that every year makes this wonderful nest on my Christmas ferns. It lays these eggs and wraps it all up into a little ball. Every year we get the same ones through. So that's a good one. You can also look for things like your foam flower, your woodland phlox. Those are all good, understories for.
Pussy willow. I mean,
Pussy willow is an excellent native.
Because I
It's
bought
also
some.
the great thing about them. Wetter areas are good for pussy willow. Not as good in deep shade. But the great thing about pussy willows is they are often blooming now and providing food for our pollinators now when we need it. It's a early season.
Because I bought some out and they're rooting in
Yes,
my
they
container.
will. They
I
will.
just didn't know if they were native or
Very
usually planted.
the pussy willows are generally the willow species. Willows, oaks. You might not get to enjoy an oak now, but you can do wonderful things planting oaks for the future. These are great keystone species, as we say. Thank you all for sticking around.
Thank
I really
you.
appreciate it.